Daniel Herriges is a policy director at the Parking Reform Network, where he works with our partner organizations to accelerate critical parking reforms through education, organization, coalition building, and direct advocacy. Prior to coming to PRN, Daniel was editor-in-chief at Strong Towns, and he is a co-author of the book Escaping the Housing Trap. Daniel has a master's in urban planning from the University of Minnesota, and he lives in St. Paul, Minnesota. So, welcome, Daniel Herriges. Please give him a warm welcome, and I'm going to stop sharing. Thanks so much, Daniel.
Thanks, Paula. Um, I am noticing now that my video is up that my kid has once again hung a random clothes hanger on the lamp behind me. So I have a 4 and a 5-year-old. Things appear in strange places in my house. I'm not going to bother to remove it, but I am going to share some slides. Um, and so, yeah, we talked at PRN about wanting to do a little more content, especially these early in the year events, making sure that our membership knows kind of what's going on with the organization, what are the things we're working on, where are we seeing interesting momentum, as well as doing more kind of one-on-one level events, knowing that, new people are attending these and joining all the time. So this is maybe going to be unlike a lot of our web events in that it's not a deep dive into any one particular reform or topic. I'm going to just cover a lot of what happened, on the ground and within the organization and in the parking reform movement over the last year. Hit on a bunch of stuff that you want to know about if you don't already know about it. And you may want to go find out more about some of it after this. So hopefully it's quick and not belabored too much and interesting and informative. We are in State of the Union season, and I am proud to announce that the state of parking in the United States and North America is strong. Parking definitely strong. There is still way too much of it everywhere. Still lots of parking. Nothing new to report on that front, but we're working on that. Um, but your voice remains needed in the battle for parking. Pray, march, sing, demand the return of parking. This was an actual flyer in San Mateo, California last month. Urging neighbors to address one of the important issues of our time, which is how dare the city take away parking um, for a bike lane. I'm proud to announce via our partners in San Mateo that this particular effort, which went on for a comical amount of time, was defeated. The bike lane that replaced some on-street parking a few years ago remains. The city council voted to keep it, but yeah, this continues to be an issue that inspires passion in folks in one direction or the other. So 2025, the first notable thing that happened in parking last year was, of course, the Professor Donald Shoup passed away early in the year, at the beginning of February. So wanted to acknowledge the forefather of parking reform, who studied it kind of in the trenches for decades when no one else thought it very worthy of their attention, and undoubtedly the reason that most of us are here today. Um, if you didn't get a chance to see this last year, we put up a page where we collected tributes to Professor Shoup. Um, and I would definitely say if you didn't get a chance to look at this, you might want to check it out. We've got about 80 personal tributes to Shoup's legacy and his teaching and his humor, and his influence on the world. And it was really a great thing to get to do and be part of. And they're really enjoyable to read. Um, and people have been working hard to carry on Shoup's legacy. The book, The Shoup Doctrine, was published last year. We got a QR code here if you're interested in more on that or in purchasing a copy. Tony Jordan, our president, is in it. He wrote a chapter. A whole bunch of PRN members are in the book. Um, it is a great collection of essays celebrating Donald Shoup and the parking reforms that he championed and sort of the state of parking reform in the US, around the world, a bunch of really interesting stuff. So, um, sort of in memory of Shoup and shortly after he passed, UCLA announced a new Center for Parking Policy. I think Ellen Schwartz, who is heading that up, is actually with us today. I think I saw you come in, Ellen. So um, thanks for joining us. And yeah, housed in the Institute for Transportation Studies, UCLA is continuing to be a hub for really, really important research on all things parking policy and parking reform. Um, I'm missing a slide here, but our contribution to, I don't know where that slide went, to celebrating Donald Troup's legacy last year was with a group of partners. We launched the annual, hopefully annual, Donald Troup Awards for Achievement in Parking Reform. We gave out three of them at the YIMBY Town Conference in New Haven last September. The individual award winner was Katie Gould from the Sightline Institute in the Pacific Northwest. Longtime PRN member and absolute champion of parking reform, has done amazing research and advocacy and storytelling around this issue in Oregon and Washington and throughout Cascadia. Um, the other winners of the Shoup Awards last year, for an organization, the winner was the Austin Parking Reform Coalition. Austin remains the largest city in the United States to have no parking mandates anywhere in the city for any use. They passed that reform in 2023 due to the tireless efforts of many of the people you see in this picture. Um, so we got to celebrate them, and last but not least, there was an award for a policymaker, which went to Representative Stephanie Vigil from Colorado, represented Colorado Springs in the state house. Lost her seat narrowly, and then but while she was in the House, she was the lead sponsor and the champion of House Bill 1304, which passed in 2024, which enacted really robust statewide parking reforms in Colorado. Um, we are hoping to do the Shoup Awards annually. So, stay tuned. There will be, I think the details are yet to come on that, but we're hoping to have a nomination process and an award ceremony later this year as well. At Yimby Town during the Shoup Award ceremony, we also announced the Chris Riley Parking Reformer Scholarship Fund. Chris Riley was a former city council member in Austin, Texas, and an early champion of parking reform way before it was cool. Um, and Chris Riley unfortunately passed away a couple years ago. But in his honor, to honor his legacy, we've partnered with some folks to fund scholarships for people doing, especially young people just getting into the field, doing important research or advocacy work on parking reform who might not otherwise have a chance to share or prevent that work. So we will fund travel to conferences, symposiums, opportunities to present and share that work. Um, the link here, the QR code here goes to the donation page. And if anyone is feeling inspired to support up and coming talent in the world of parking reform, parking research, please do. We would be very grateful. So, with Shoup as sort of the theme of the introduction to last year in parking reform, how are we doing in terms of implementing the Shoup doctrine in the world? Eliminating parking mandates, managing the curb, managing parking demand at the curb, and then using that money in ways that create a virtuous cycle. Let's talk first about mandates, because last year was a really exciting year um, in terms of the battle to reduce and eliminate parking mandates. If you've been following our work, you know about some of these stories, but I'll just kind of do a rundown of where the action was last year. Um, we are up to 122 cities with no parking mandates at all. Those are the red dots on our reform map. And we finally, in 2025, we passed the threshold of 100 cities in the United States. The US total at current count, I believe, is 110. So upward trajectory continues. Every region of the country, every kind of geography, cities, small towns, Sunbelt, Northeast, West Coast, you name it. Here are the 20 cities in North America that enacted this reform in 2025. And so some highlights from last year, and these were campaigns that PRN was in most cases involved in pretty closely. Dallas, Texas passed its first substantial parking reform since 1965, after a massive effort by advocates, city planners, a council member. Paula mentioned earlier, we're going to be doing a webinar in early March with some of the people who are really integral to this effort. So you'll have a chance to hear all about it. Dallas still has parking requirements, but far fewer, far less onerous than what they had. Really substantial reforms, making it possible to build more housing, especially apartment housing in Dallas. Reforms affecting small businesses, making it easier to open a small business in a commercial corridor and not be hamstrung by parking requirements. Some really great storytelling and documenting of the harms of parking mandates came out of this effort. Chicago, Illinois gets an asterisk because there's about, I've been told 4% of the city where you still maybe have to build some parking. Chicago is so close to eclipsing Austin as the biggest US city with that red dot. What they did do last year in July was they passed a full repeal of parking mandates within walking distance of transit. Chicago being Chicago, that is the vast majority of the city's land area. So you can now build just about anything in Chicago without having to meet an arbitrary parking quota. Denver, Colorado, over the summer eliminated all of its parking requirements. Congratulations to Denver. And in the fall, Baltimore. As Paula mentioned, Baltimore is now the largest city on the eastern seaboard of the US to have no parking mandates at all. Um, and that was an effort launched along with some other land use and housing reforms by a couple of city council members, one of whom, Councilman Zach Blanchard, we are going to have on a PRN Lunch and Learn on March 6th. Um, the rest of the class of 2025, these are the other cities ranked by population. Toledo, Shreveport, Sherbrooke representing Canada here. A lot of Oregon and Washington. The story there, for those who don't know, um, is Oregon has a bunch of administrative rules that essentially make it the path of least resistance for local cities to eliminate their parking mandates. So a whole bunch of smaller towns and suburbs have done this in Oregon, more so than in any other state. Um, Washington, we see a bunch of cities responding, either preemptively or shortly after the passage of a state law dramatically curtailing parking mandates. So the Seattle suburbs of Shoreline, Bothell, across the Puget Sound, you've got Bremerton, all represented here as examples. Um, Here's our Dallas event if you want to scan that QR code, or just we'll have a link in the chat too. I think we already had one. We'll have another one at the end. Thursday, March 5th, if you want to hear all about the victory in Dallas, or Friday, March 6th, if you want to hear all about Baltimore, please join us. One trend that I think we can confidently call a trend now is state law as an accelerating factor for parking reforms. Denver and Boulder both notably fully eliminated their parking mandates last summer. And what happened there was that Colorado passed a state law eliminating parking requirements near rapid transit in 2024. And we have explicitly understand that Denver basically looked at that and said, okay, 70 to 80% of the city is now exempt from parking mandates. We can enforce this patchwork map that the state has overlaid on our code, or we can go the rest of the way and just clean it up. I think we've seen the same thing happen with a bunch of those Washington state cities. So state law increasingly, even if it doesn't go all the way to full elimination of mandates, it is providing the impetus. It's making local reforms easier and more palatable. And 2025, maybe the biggest trend in parking reform last year was that this was the year that state level reform absolutely blew up. Um, we have a story map of American parking legislation, both introduced and passed. So, including tracking a bunch of bills back to 2019 that didn't reach full passage. But definitely check out this resource. You can get to it through our website, or hopefully we can get a link in the chat for this as well. But last year was the year that state law really took a couple big swings at parking mandates. Washington State, deep blue, Washington State, Democratic trifecta in the legislature and the governor's seat. Montana, deep red, Republican trifecta. Those two states passed extremely similar, dare I say, almost identical parking reform legislation last year. This is an issue that cuts across conventional political boundaries. Both of the states, we'll talk in a moment about what it was that they did. But most residential and commercial parking mandates, especially for small homes and small businesses, are effectively gone in these states. New Hampshire put a cap on residential parking mandates. with support from a lot of housing advocates on the ground, Welcoming Neighbors Network there. North Carolina's House unanimously passed a bill to abolish all parking mandates statewide. North Carolina has a 2-year session, so that bill is going to be before the state Senate later this spring. And our fingers are tightly crossed for North Carolina to make history. But that bill is sponsored by the Catawba Riverkeeper Organization, and it was introduced as a stormwater measure, directly targeting the ways in which parking requirements contribute to excess asphalt, causing flooding problems, causing polluted runoff. Um, Illinois, late in the year, as part of the big transit omnibus package, Illinois eliminated parking mandates near rail stations throughout the state, which in the Chicago suburbs, that's over 100 commuter rail stations where you now don't have to build parking to any particular quota. And Connecticut passed what is effectively a full repeal of residential parking requirements. The Connecticut Parking Reform Campaign, we've featured them in events before. Casey Moran and Tom Broderick did amazing work using PRN's resources. They used our parking lot map methodology. They mapped the surface parking in every single downtown in Connecticut, 169 towns, I believe, um, and used that as the centerpiece of an effort to convince legislators to roll back parking requirements in the state. Um, and what eventually passed, there are some carve outs um, where you kind of have to allow a developer to do a parking study to justify the amount that they want to build. But if they do that, that study is binding. So the net effect of the reform in Connecticut is that for residential projects, you no longer have to build any arbitrary amount of parking. So huge, huge victories last year. Um, when we talk about statewide parking legislation, especially with those who want to pursue it in their own state, we're increasingly kind of referring to this taxonomy, these different approaches you can take to the issue that we've seen be successful. Um, One is a transit-based model where we specifically target parking requirements in areas served by high-frequency transit. California led the way in 2022 with a bill that does this. Colorado in 2024, Illinois last year. We see Maryland working on this right now. There's a bill making its way through the state Senate with the support of the governor in Maryland right now that would do the same thing if it passes. Um, so specifically targeting transit proximity is one way that we've seen folks take a slice of the issue of parking mandates. Um, Another the model they used in Washington State and Montana, that bill spearheaded by the Sightline Institute, our close partners there. We're calling this cap and exclude. The approach used in Washington was we're going to put caps on parking mandates. We're going to limit you how high you can set them, um, sort of in a broad-based way for residential and commercial projects, and specifically targeting small residences, so any housing unit under 1,200 square feet in the case of Washington, um, or any business space under 3,000 square feet. Um, you can do a lot of persuasion around this because you're really talking about the homes that are most affordable to people who need a starter home. You're talking about mom and pop businesses in your community and the ways in which parking requirements are onerous for them. Washington coupled those broad based caps with exclusions for very specific land uses that, in the advocacy, we kind of talked about them as sympathetic uses, child care centers, affordable housing, senior housing, categories of land use for which you don't have to build any parking at all. Um, and then there's full repeal, and we have yet to see a U.S. state pass a full repeal statewide of parking mandates. But as I said, our fingers are crossed that North Carolina might be the first one this year. Um, some of the challenges we've seen for state reforms from last year's experience and moving forward. Um, One is the need to just be aggressive and not kind of pre-politic your own proposal, kind of wimpify it from the beginning. Um, what passes is what passes. After the sausage making, after the compromise, what can get the votes. Um, but it's important to acknowledge that bill in Washington was introduced as a complete repeal of parking requirements for all uses. The bill in Connecticut was introduced as a complete repeal. What we advise people to do at PRN is we say parking mandates are arbitrary. Um, You can look at the history of them. You can see very clearly there's no, there's no demand study. There's no body of evidence supporting the idea of having an arbitrary number in your code. And this is how much parking you need to build for this use. So why grant the opponents that? Come out of the gate saying, the onus is on you to defend the idea that these mandates should exist at all, and then see where you get from there. We continue to work to support reformers with how to address the initial pushback, often just from policymakers who aren't familiar with the issue, and the reactions you hear up front. Well, what about people who need cars? We don't have mass transit everywhere. People can't bike everywhere. Getting people over the hump of hearing eliminate parking mandates and hearing the first two words eliminate parking and getting scared. Um, Countering the local control argument. The strongest opponent to virtually every one of these state bills has been the statewide League of Cities or Municipal League or whatever it's called locally. Um, and it's not necessarily that local governments are uniformly opposed to repealing parking mandates. The argument that these organizations make is the state should not take control of local zoning away from cities. Um, the argument that we make is that actually it's perfectly reasonable for a state to set some guardrails on the abuse of zoning by localities. But this continues to be, kind of the primary one of the primary political axes around which this issue sorts itself. That question of local control and when and how should we preempt it. Um, and then part of the argument for parking reform is you don't need to require arbitrary amounts of off-street parking. What you do need to do is manage your on-street parking supply. And if you're worried about spillover, if you're worried about the curbs becoming congested, manage the curb. Um, and what our partners out in the field have heard a lot from skeptical legislators is um, you're giving cities an unfunded mandate. You're tasking them to do something that they don't feel prepared to do. I talk to the mayors in my district, and they don't feel like they can institute curb restrictions or curb pricing. So one thing we're going to be continuing to focus on a lot at PRN is providing answers on how do you start with curb management that feel actionable and attainable for cities, um, so that you don't have that excuse of, well, we couldn't possibly regulate who gets to park on the street. Well, yeah, you can. Um, Another thing we've seen, like for those who, remember kind of the era of cassette tapes, you had a mixtape and you copied it and then you copied the copy, and the audio quality went a little bit downhill every time. Um, we see this happen with policy. This is a common problem with public policy. We've seen it with parking legislation. Um, it's almost like a bad game of telephone. Like the quality of each copy is going to degrade a little bit. So one thing that happens is that a bill will be introduced, and then compromises will be written into it as amendments in order to secure key votes. And then somebody comes along in another state and says, "Well, we like what they did over there. We're just going to copy your bill text." And what you end up doing is you copy the sort of illogical compromise that was made to secure a vote. Here's a very specific example of this. And these bills are public; they've been introduced, so I can talk about this one. Washington State, as parking reform made its way through the legislature, they exempted from the bill's provisions portions of cities within a 1 mile radius of a commercial airport with at least 9 million annual enplanements. That was specifically at the request of the city of SeaTac, which is a suburb of Seattle. It shares the name of the Seattle Tacoma International Airport. Um, and it basically carves SeaTac out of the bill. The state of Indiana has a bill making its way through the state Senate right now that contains the exact same language. It doesn't name SeaTac, but basically the Indiana parking bill, if it passes, is going to include the SeaTac exemption, um, because they look to Washington as a model. But if you're in the position of, working with legislation, helping draft it, advising those who are drafting it, always advise people to go back to the source, go back to what was introduced, not to the messy thing with all the compromises. Don't make a bad copy of a copy. Um, we relaunched PRN's organizing roundtable last year. This is still going on this year. These are monthly information sharing and strategy calls for advocates working on parking reform at the local or state level. If you're involved with an active campaign, definitely encourage you to check out the roundtable. If you haven't been part of this, but you want to attend one, shoot me an email, daniel@parkingreform.org, and I can get you an invite to those. We do them on the second Friday of every month. Um, but this has been a tremendous place for advocates actively in the middle of campaigns to share advice and information with each other. And we've seen a lot of kind of cross pollination of bill language, ideas, messaging, thanks to these calls. Um, in 2025, we launched our local action program. We're kind of building the plane in the air on this one, I'll be honest, but we're hoping to really ramp this up over the next couple of years. Um, this is a program of more comprehensive and deliberate and organized support from PRN for a local campaign kind of from start to finish. So if you are launching a parking reform effort or have launched a parking reform effort in your place, if you've got some coalition partners, if you've got some contacts with elected officials, but you want help making the case, preparing materials, maybe preparing some research or data that's local, get in touch with us because we're interested in a few guinea pigs for this program this year. The other area in which PRN is working to kind of ramp up the support and the resources we can provide is on-street management, which is basically the idea that um, rather than have a free-for-all at the curb, let's actually manage parking demand by setting the price, either explicitly through meters or an app, implicitly through something like permits. But let's set the price and actually maintain access to the parking that does exist so that you can reliably park when you need to. You're not circling the block. This was one of Donald Shoup's key insights. Um, and we're working to really kind of spread the gospel of parking demand management and effective dynamic curb management. Um, it's a little harder to summarize this than to summarize the parking mandate reforms because there often isn't an ordinance, there isn't a vote of the city council, there isn't like a big moment where you can say, okay, this city did this. Um, but we're seeing conversations in our Slack. People are emailing us asking for meetings, and these are some of the themes that we're seeing. Um, Need for one-on-one level guidance, need to sort of demystify curb management, especially for smaller communities, make it something that feels attainable and like that they should do. So how do you go from free parking to paid parking if you've never had paid parking? Um, Really articulating and selling what is the value proposition in doing this. Paid parking is not a money grab. It's not just a free revenue source for your city. It's actually something that should make parking work better. It should make parking work better for the driver who's looking for a parking spot, um, because you can make it available where you need it to be available by pricing it appropriately. Um, Technology changing quickly in this area, so we're seeing a lot of efforts by cities to measure their occupancy in a more fine-grained and a more ongoing way, as opposed to doing a study once a year, once every couple of years, really tracking who's using the on-street parking and for how long and where. Um, the parking industry, the app-based payment providers are working toward, very interested in working toward an open market model. That's something that's much more common overseas, especially in Europe, than it is in North America. But the idea that you're not locked into a single provider. Right now, how many of you have 8 or 9 apps on your phone for when you park in different cities and you need to use their parking app? Um, Open market is the idea that you should be able to come in and use whatever app you want to pay for parking on the street, as long as it meets the city's guidelines and can plug into their database. Um, so we've seen things like this, and we're trying to track efforts like this. Pilot project in Arlington, Virginia, using in-ground sensors. Um, the first phase of that concluded last June, and they used it to tweak the pricing of parking, not on a district level or a neighborhood level, but in a really fine-grained way. Going up in some places, going down in some, with the goal that you actually ease crowding in the places where the parking is really crowded. You steer drivers toward the places where parking is available. You make the whole system function better. That's just a great example of how technology can help us do that, and we're seeing more and more cities interested in these kinds of efforts. PRN's goal here is to continue to be a clearinghouse for information and advice. Not to do a lot of direct consulting. We're small. That's not our model. But to connect you to what you need to know. We're launching our policy cookbook, which is a collection of case studies of parking reforms, kind of bite-sized policy profiles, non-technical, non-jargony, meant to be idea starters. That's coming out in March. We're doing a webinar on it in late March. Our Slack community is, as always, home to lots of conversations. It's a great place to ask a question and have someone with a lot of expertise answer your question. We expanded our reform map in 2025. We did a webinar in January on that, um, on the changes that were made to the map, which make the underlying data infrastructure a little bit more robust, and make it possible for us to track multiple reforms per city, and multiple kinds of reforms. So we're going to work to populate that map, not just with which cities have removed their parking mandates, but also with things like curb management projects, like parking benefit districts. Um, we're going to keep doing our organizing roundtable. We've collaborated with the Metropolitan Abundance Project on model legislation, two pieces last year, one on removing parking mandates, and then one on sort of a curb management enabling act, a model state law that you could pass that basically says cities have the right to charge for parking at the curb. They have the right to put that revenue into a PBD. Um, removing some of the arbitrary barriers that exist here and there in state law, to actually doing market-based parking management and pricing. And then, as always, our webinars and events are a key source of information sharing where we try to keep you all updated on the state of things. Um, so you can see this is our reform map. We're up to over 4,000 records, and growing. And as I said, hoping to add more of the on-street stuff to this map. Um, we've done a lot of events on sort of the cutting edge of curb management. These are just three examples from last year. You can find all of these on our YouTube channel. Um, we did a session with Madison Hummer and Chris Head from Arrive, which is the parent company of Park Mobile, talking about open market app interoperability so that you aren't locked into a vendor for on-street payment. We did a great session with Sandra Rothbard on urban shipping and freight and loading. Um, we had a planning commissioner from East Palo Alto, California, talking about a drone methodology for using a simple aerial drone to capture parking occupancy block by block. And this is something he explains in great detail how to do it. Your city can do it too. So these are just the kind of events. Here's more examples. Our YouTube channel has a lot of our past webinars and lunch and learns, and I strongly encourage folks to go see what's there that might be interesting to you. Um, and as always, we're trying to stay abreast and just exercise whatever thought leadership we can on evolving challenges in parking management. How do we better accommodate loading zones, ride hailing, freight deliveries? Um, how is the rise of autonomous vehicles going to affect curb management? Electrification, getting robust access to electric vehicle charging, without essentially reinventing parking mandates in the form of charging mandates on private property, because every EV charger is also a parking spot. So these are the kinds of challenges that we're trying to engage with folks in, provide information, share best practices. Um, that's about what I got. And I can't see exactly what time it is, but I'd be happy to take some questions.
So, okay, we have a question from John Levin. What technological innovations, existing or pending, have you most excited?
Interesting. I'm not even the best person to ask that question because I don't get that excited about tech. And we have our internal discussions at PRN about things like autonomous vehicles and where that's going. I tend to be the Luddite who engages with this stuff with a certain amount of trepidation. Um, I don't think it's tremendously innovative, but I really do see the potential of the kind of real time sort of inventory management, just actually knowing how much parking you have, knowing what the occupancy looks like, and where parking is available. Um, just the ways in which, sensors and cameras, and that's become much more accessible at lower cost, I think has the potential to simultaneously reduce excess parking and make the experience of parking better for drivers in a lot of places. Whereas in the past, this was maybe something that a big city could do, or a big institution could do. I think that's changing. Um, if Tony would give you a different answer to that, and Tony's even welcome to unmute and share his thoughts if he'd like to, but not to put you on the spot. Um, just because, yeah, I'm the token Luddite here. It was like I don't.
I gotta actually pop off in a second 'cause I have a call coming up right now. But I think I mean I think that the technologies I think that make it easier to manage on-street parking are extremely exciting and make it easier to charge and collect payments. Just to remove the frictions and make it easier for cities to roll things out on pilots and smaller cases. I also think that the technology is always worth using as a narrative, whether or not you actually even believe in it entirely. Like autonomous vehicles are a powerful narrative for that people might not need to own a car, and you can convince a city council person that they can relax zoning because some people will be able to live in here if they can use Lyft and Uber and Waymo or e-bikes or whatever the technology is. So, I mean, and I'll say that the two technologies I really wish were being used more would be shared e-bikes systems and shared motor vehicle systems, whether they be autonomous or pick up and drive around. So, I think that's great tech. Okay, so that's me. Have fun.
Yeah, I will amend my previous claim to Luddism because I am a very satisfied e-bike owner, and I think the e-bike is a remarkable piece of technology. Bill McKibben, longtime climate advocate, gave the keynote at YimbyTown last year and described e-bikes as a bike without hills. Um, and yeah, I think that that is a potentially really transformative technology. If anything, it already has been more so in other parts of the world, and the US is kind of the laggard on this. And unfortunately, there's a backlash going on right now. New Jersey just passed what I would consider a really terrible law restricting e-bike access, requiring essentially that it be treated kind of as almost a motorcycle in terms of the permit you have to operate one and the age restrictions on doing so. And the reality is that your average e-bike that's capped at 20 miles an hour, where you do have to pedal and it's a pedal assist, like that's not a motorcycle. But I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of the technology, and we're seeing these backlash campaigns, and hopefully one's not coming to a state near you.
We have a question in the chat. Max, would you like to unmute yourself and share your question, or you want me to read it?
Sure, I'll go for it. Thanks, Daniel. I learned a lot. That was super interesting. One weird thing I'm noticing in Colorado is we're finally winning on parking reform. I mean, incrementally, but we're actually losing momentum on like bike, walk, bus, just kind of general urbanism stuff. And it's the same people advocating for them. Do these tend to be linked in other cities? Same advocates, wins happening at the same time? And like, are we alone here in winning on parking reform and like losing on all this other stuff?
You are not. I think that that's a common lament. That's one I've more broadly, I think what I've seen discussed in some of the advocacy spaces, the major conferences and stuff last year, is this notion that we're land use reform is having a moment largely because of pro housing advocacy. And then the active transportation folks are part of that coalition. The environmental folks are part of that coalition, may even be leading on a particular initiative. Um, but, um, land use reform, zoning reform campaigns are really winning in a big way in a lot of places. And I think there is obviously one of the big distinctions is, are you asking government to simply remove an obstacle, or are you asking them to fund something? Um, so um, I don't have any like deeply insightful off the cuff thoughts for you on this, other than that, yeah, I think it is a huge problem um, everywhere, not just in Colorado.
Okay.
And I think one thing that's up to advocates is to make the case, to figure out how to make the case that these things are linked in really important ways, but in a way that doesn't sort of narrow the appeal to, someone who already thinks of themselves as an urbanist. Right. But like, if you actually want to achieve the benefits of parking reform, if you actually want to see excess parking reductions or, a reduction of the externalities that parking creates in our cities, then you also need these alternative modes of transportation to be viable and attractive and compete with driving for folks. If you want to actually see the benefits of a lot of the pro housing reform that has occurred, you need to tackle the mobility side of things. And I think we are way behind on figuring out how to build the coalition for that stuff, beyond just narrowly like bike walk transit advocates.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm hopeful that there's like a hangover from post-COVID and work from home where like a lot of cities have like more disorder than they did before. So some of like the optimism about these being like multimodal paradises has waned, but I'm kind of hoping that's temporary and like budgets are tight right now. And yeah, I think you're right. The parking wins have been, couched in making housing more affordable. Anyway, thank you for that thought.
Also, John Russell, would you like to share a little bit more of your experience with Portland and paid parking and free parking?
Good morning. John Russell. I should say that I might work for the state of Oregon, but this is just speaking of my in a personal capacity as a member of neighborhood parking stakeholder advisory committee. The single biggest thing that I witnessed over multiple years was literally just having a parking enforcement officer from PBOT, the Portland Bureau of Transportation, come in, and they talked about their experience basically going out and enforcing parking, writing tickets. And essentially, the thing that really flipped the switch for me and has helped me flip that switch for a lot of other people was the explanation, at least in Oregon, that parking fines, something like half of that just goes to the state judicial department for the court system. They're entirely punitive. The money isn't coming back directly into the neighborhood, and the rest of the money is just going, at least in Portland's case, I don't know how widely this applies outside of Oregon. It's just going into the general fund. And so I had long joked that I have enough people parking in front of my driveway, blocking the crosswalk in front of my house, all these different things that I was individually funding parking enforcement. And once I found out that in my case, joke was completely unfounded, really just steered me towards the realization that if you charge for parking, you give people the affirmative chance to consensually pay a couple of bucks rather than every once in a while pay $100 or more against their will. And you allow people to choose to pay in just a little bit at a time to a system where, by law, at least in Portland, 51% of that money comes back directly to the parking benefit district. And as soon as the people who are potentially going to be in that district or on that committee for the district realized this was a huge pot of money that was going to come specifically back to their district, you could just see the light bulb, the switch go off, and it's like, oh yeah, do you see the things that they're getting over in Northwest Portland because they have paid parking? They're getting, safer sidewalks, all the things that the values that we had spent over a year talking about in these, stakeholder advisory committees. Once they realized that just that simple switch of charging $1 or $2, some of that money would be coming back and funding those. You could see even business owners who were previously maybe supportive of, oh, let's do timed parking, but not paid parking. Once parking enforcement explained that in order to do the time parking, you've got to enforce before, during, after, and you're not even recovering the money to pay for itself, but just the simple putting a way to let folks chip in, $1 at a time. All of that money stays in and can actually go back to fund improvements and really flip the switch for a lot of people. How long that will actually take to implement, I know our northeast parking plan has taken extra time to get through. I don't think it's even gotten to the city council level, but just actually going out and talking to parking enforcement and seeing how the money moves around in your local jurisdiction. I'll just say from our perspective, having access to that really changed the conversation, because before that, people were like, oh no, I don't want to pay anything for something I'm getting for free, and explaining you're not just not getting anything, you're leaving money on the table. And once people understood that, very, very stark change in opinions.
Thank you for those insights. That's great. Yeah. I think there's a lot that kind of we don't we have anecdotes, but that we don't know yet about just how do you broadly increase the palatability of some of this stuff. The politics of paid parking are much tougher in some ways than the politics of parking mandates. But yeah, allowing people to actually see what it is that you're getting, um, and reframing it as, free parking is a parking subsidy. Free, you're leaving money on the table because you're doing this enforcement. I think that's really, you know, that stuff is really persuasive. I wonder, I don't know, one discussion we've had with folks from a couple cities looking at curb management programs that gets tricky is like business customers and residents are not looking for exactly the same thing. And people, residents in their own neighborhood are looking for absolute predictability. I want to know I can park near my house. Um, and so from an economic standpoint, like, um, we want to charge in a dynamic way that is demand driven. Residential permits have a bunch of downsides just in terms of policy design, but are maybe much more politically palatable because the perception of the resident is you got your monthly permit, your annual permit. We're giving you a guarantee of something, even if in reality that may not be true. Um, so
I think we are close to wrap up the session. So this is the time for one last question, if someone has one. If not, please remember that Daniel is always available. You can shoot him an email if you have a specific question, if you want to join the organizing roundtable. Yeah, we are here also. Mm, so, okay, I think I'm going to start wrapping up. If anyone has another question, feel free to interrupt me. Okay. So, well, Danielle, I think this was a really cool recap of everything. So thank you so much for sharing all of these cases, studies, examples that happened last year. FYI, everyone, we're going to try to do one of these every year so that we can give like a recap of what has happened. And with this, I want to thank everyone for being here. I'm going to paste one last bulk of links in the chat. Sorry. So this last bulk is just our Luma calendar for you to stay tuned to our events, our link to join if you like to be part of our community. And the last one is a feedback form because we love to continue improving. So please feel free to share your thoughts, ideas, future webinars, if you like them, if you not. Like we always love reading your comments. It's a one less than a minute feedback form. So yeah, we'll appreciate if you can fill that. And with this, I think, yeah. So thank you so much, everyone. I encourage you to unmute yourselves and say goodbye while I close the session.